Barbara Krahé qui va nous parler aujourd'hui du rôle des scripts sexuels pour comprendre les violences sexuelles. Cette conférence va être en anglais, donc je vais refaire cette petite introduction en anglais. Hi Barbara, thank you so much for being here today. We're going to talk about the role of sexual scripts in understanding sexual violence. It's a good continuity of what we just saw now, where in the previous talk we had someone, Florian Veros, telling us about the influence of porn and men, heterosexual men, facing their responsibility with regards to their fantasies. So it was very interesting, and I think your talk will be right in the continuity of this.
Hello, and a very warm welcome from Berlin to my talk on sexual scripts and understanding sexual violence. I would like to say thank you very much to the organizers of this important event for inviting me to share some of my thoughts about the role of sexual scripts in relation to the importance of obtaining sexual consent and the interplay of these different aspects in understanding sexual violence. I'm very sorry that I cannot be in Paris in person to give my talk. I would have loved to return to Paris after many visits. Hopefully this will be possible another time. Right, I would like to begin by talking about the first key word in my title, namely the construct of sexual violence, and then I'll move on to saying a little bit more about sexual scripts, and then bring together the two constructs of sexual scripts and sexual violence based on some of the research we've done in Potsdam. First of all, to be clear that we are in agreement about the subject of this talk, I would like to offer and share our definition of sexual violence, which is behavior that's carried out with the intention or the result of making another person engage in sexual activity despite their unwillingness to do so. So as you can see, this is a consent-based definition which we adopt for our research. And this definition of sexual violence also involves activities with direct physical contact between a perpetrator and a non-consenting person, a victim. And this is somewhat different from the concept of sexual harassment, which is broader in a way and includes non-contact forms of unwanted sexual attention. For example, receiving sexualized images that one doesn't agree with, or receiving unwanted sexualized comments. In my talk today, I want to talk on sexual violence, that is, those forms of non-consensual sexual contact that involves direct physical contact. Sexual violence can take different forms in terms of the sexual activities to which someone is subjected against their will. For example, sexual touch without consent, but also attempted or completed penetration of the body without consent. And these forms of non-consensual sexual activities can be forced upon another person using different strategies. One is the use or threat of physical force. Another strategy is exploiting the person's inability to resist, exploiting the fact that someone is unable to express non-consent, for example, because they are asleep or because they are too drunk, or the use of verbal pressure, for example, threatening to end the relationship. There are, of course, more strategies, also important, for example, exploiting a position of authority as a boss or as a teacher. But the focus of our research has been on these three coercive strategies and these different forms of sexual activities. Just to give you an idea how in social science research, sexual aggression and victimization can actually be measured empirically, I want to show you here the instrument that we have designed and use in our research, which, as you will see, uses quite specific behavioral descriptions. For example, this is the item reflecting the definition of rape. This is the version for female participants. for homosexual men. Has a man ever made or tried to make you have sexual contact with him against your will by threatening to use force or by harming you? And then our research participants indicate for each of the relationship constellations, current or former partner, friend or acquaintance, or a stranger, whether or not they have ever been made to engage in these different sexual activities. And I also want to mention that we're dealing here with a very sensitive topic, which may bring up very difficult traumatic experiences. And this is why you can see the help button, the button at the bottom of the screen. When participants press this help button, they are transferred to a member of our research team, and then we try and clarify whether they need psychological support. But I have to say, with many thousand participants who've completed this measure, this has very rarely been used. We've used this instrument, for example, just to give you some idea about prevalence rates in a multi-country study, including 10 European Union countries. And what you can see here is the percentage of male and female participants who say yes to at least one of the questions about the experience of non-consensual sex. And if you just want to look at the overall rates, you can see that about a third of all female participants across the different countries have experienced at least one incident of non-consensual sex. But you can also see that the male rate is fairly high as well. When you look at the different countries, you see that this is primarily due to Cyprus and Greece, where we have very high prevalence rates. But I should note that this is not a representative sample, not a nationally representative sample, but a convenient sample of students. So these findings have to be interpreted with caution. But the fact that men can also be victims of sexual aggression is becoming increasingly recognized in the international research literature. Now let's move on to the second construct in the title of my talk, namely sexual scripts. The script construct is quite a well-known and established construct in social psychology in general. The term has been borrowed from the media domain, and it is used to describe mental representations of sequences of events. So what do we mean by mental representations? Individuals learn in the course of development that certain situations tend to take place in more or less the same way whenever they are encountered. A well-known example is the restaurant script, and another well-known example is the laundry script. The restaurant script, for example, when you go to eat in a restaurant, you know what the sequence of events is. You know that you wait to be seated, that you will be given the menu, you will order your food, you will wait for a while, then you will get your food, eat it, pay for it, and leave. And you have this as kind of general knowledge stored in your head so that you don't have to learn the situation again every time you enter a restaurant. So this is essentially the idea of a script. The laundry script is when you do your washing, you know exactly that you're not supposed to put the dark socks together with the white shirts in high temperature wash, because otherwise your white shirts might turn black. And again, this is not something you think about every single time you do it. You have a mental representation of how this task is to be accomplished. And these scripted knowledge formats are learned through direct experience, for example, by going to a restaurant many times, but also through the media by seeing other people do it. Now this reference to script-based knowledge in general, we're not talking about sexual scripts specifically at the moment, we are talking about scripts more generally. They have important functions for our mental operations and for our dealing with the world. These scripts organize perception. And there are many studies to show that information that's consistent with the script is more likely to be noticed. So if you have a script of women, for example, being poor drivers, unable to park their cars in a narrow space, then you are more likely to notice a situation where a female driver has trouble getting into a small parking space than a male driver. Our scripts also serve to organize memory. People are better at remembering information that fits their script, and they find it difficult to remember sequences of events that are not consistent with their script. And scripts influence how we evaluate people or situations. For example, when we see people behaving in a way that is not consistent with our script of that situation, we think they are strange, they are odd, and we tend to evaluate them in a negative way. And perhaps most importantly, certainly for our talk today, is that scripts tell us how to behave. They are powerful thoughts that guide our behavior. And so this general idea about the function, the psychological function of sexual scripts has been, scripts in general has been applied to the domain of sexuality in the construct of sexual scripts. Sexual scripts are defined as socially shared ways of thinking about situations in which sex takes place. And sexual scripts have two important components, elements. First component refers to what typically happens in sexual situations, in sexual interactions. For example, one such typical element in many cultures, even nowadays, is that men should initiate sexual contact and women should be the gatekeepers who say either yes or no. And the second component is an evaluation, an evaluative component, namely how one should behave in a certain situation. For example, part of the gendered stereotypes about sex is that women shouldn't say yes to a man's advances straight away. They might say no at first, even though they may mean yes. And so that this is a kind of normative belief, which is part of the sexual script. In research on sexual scripts, there are various traditions, various different kinds of scripts that people have looked at. One is the hookup script. So that's a situation in where you pick someone up at a party, at a disco, and you have sex with them on the same night without having met them before and knowing them well. The second is the seduction script. What does such a situation look like where you seduce someone, maybe by offering them drinks or by making compliments? And the last two scripts are the ones that I would like to say a little bit more about, that we have investigated in our own research. And that's the risky sexual script. The idea originally resulted from the recognition that we know quite a bit about risk factors of sexual aggression, victimization, and perpetration. For example, that alcohol is a risk factor for both, and also having sex with people one doesn't know at all is also associated with a higher risk of sexual aggression, victimization, and perpetration. And so the idea was that if these behaviors are part of a person's sexual script for consensual sex, then this might lead them to show this corresponding behavior, for example, drinking a lot when having sex, and that this in turn makes them more vulnerable to experiencing sexual victimization or more likely to engage in sexual aggression perpetration. So this is the risky part of risky sexual scripts. That is a script for consensual sex that has these known risk factors for sexual aggression embedded in the script. And the second script I want to mention briefly is the real rape script. This refers to the way in which individuals perceive non-consensual sex, and in particular rape. And the real rape script is the idea that a real rape happens between people who don't know each other, that involves physical force, the victim fights back, and so on. And I want to say a little bit about how this real rape script shapes society's understanding of rape and what the implications are of this all the way we think about rape and evaluate rape victims. Okay, so bringing sexual scripts and sexual violence together. I've already tried to explain that we have a particular understanding of risky sexual scripts, and we think that risky sexual scripts are that sexual scripts for consensual sex are risky if they contain elements that we know are linked to sexual aggression, victimization, and perpetration. And in particular, these risk factors can be categorized into three aspects. One very widely established risk factor of sexual victimization and sexual aggression perpetration is having sex with people one does not know. This is basically the hookup situation where you meet someone, you don't know them at all, you haven't had a chance to develop a relationship of trust, and that makes it more likely to meet a person who is a sexual aggressor. Drinking alcohol in the context of sexual interactions is also a very widely established risk factor for both victimization and perpetration. And we know from a lot of research on the effects of alcohol that the critical aspect here is that alcohol impairs, undermines the assessment of risk, as well as the control of behavioral impulses. So victims are less likely to recognize warning signs when they are intoxicated, and perpetrators are less likely to inhibit aggressive behavior when they are under the influence of alcohol. And the third risk factor has to do with the way in which consent is and sexual intentions are communicated. The less clear the interaction partners communicate their sexual wishes and desires, the more likely it is that misunderstandings will arise or that potential perpetrators will feel justified to ignore another person's no. And to the extent that the sexual script includes things like women should always say no at first so that the man has to put a bit more pressure on them, or if the consensual script contains the belief that when a woman says no, she's just waiting for a bit more effort on behalf of the man. That's part of the sexual script that makes it risky. These sexual scripts have been investigated at different levels: the cultural script, the cultural sexual script, as we can extract it from media presentations of sexual interactions. It's shared within cultural groups, it's expressed in public discourse. And then there is the level of interpersonal scripts, the scripts that are shared by interaction partners, and which may, of course, overlap to different degrees with the cultural script, because people learn their scripts from the culture in which they live and grow up. And then there are individual scripts, which reflect an individual's endorsement of the cultural script. It is one thing to know, for example, the sexual script's definition of appropriate male and female behavior, but it's another thing to actually say, okay, this is my personal script, this is how I behave in a range of different situations. And we have shown in several studies, which I unfortunately don't have time to present here today, that it's the individual scripts in particular that influence sexual behavior. course, again, the individual scripts don't come from nowhere. They are informed by the culture and the interpersonal relationships. But the important thing here is that people actually accept these script elements for themselves and translate them into behavior. But how do we measure risky sexual scripts? We measure them by presenting participants with a hypothetical scenario of a first sexual intercourse with a new partner. And we ask them to imagine this situation. You spend the evening with a man or a woman, and in the course of the evening, you sleep together for the first time. And we ask people not to think about a particular single situation, but their general understanding of what such a situation would look like for them. And just to give you a quick idea how we measure it, we ask them to think about the situation, and then we ask them various questions. For example, the ambiguous communication of sexual intentions. We ask if the woman or the man starts making sexual advances, how likely is it that you will first say no, even though you also want to have sex with them? Or how likely is it that you will yes, even though you don't really want it? And so we get these ratings, how likely this is, and from that and other questions, we can, for each of our participants, arrive at a score of risky sexual scripts. And these risky sexual scripts are then proposed to influence sexual behavior. That is, if I think that alcohol consumption is part of a typical sexual encounter that I have consensually, then I'm more likely to show this in my behavior, that is to drink alcohol in sexual interactions. And then the key prediction is that this is linked to a greater probability of experiencing or engaging in non-consensual sexual concepts. And we have demonstrated this sequence in several longitudinal studies where the same participants are followed over repeated measurements in 5 countries so far: Germany, Poland, Turkey, Brazil, and Chile. And we have been able to support this sequence from sexual scripts to sexual behavior to sexual violence in each of these 5 countries. And in some of these studies, we went a step further and asked ourselves, where do the risky sexual scripts come from? And one potential answer, linking individual scripts to the cultural scripts, lies in the use of pornography. Because quite often in pornography, you see women say no at first, and then the man puts a bit more pressure on the woman, and then eventually she says yes, or she says no, but then seems to be enjoying it. So these are all features of pornography that may influence sexual scripts. And indeed, we can show that the more frequently people use pornography and the more realistic they find it, the more likely they are to have risky sexual scripts. So it's quite clear that our conceptions about consensual sex, depending on what the scripts look like, play a role in understanding when and who will experience or engage in sexual violence. Okay, now I want to move on to the other script that I want to talk about, which is also relevant for understanding public conceptions of consent and sexual violence, and that's the real rape script. I already mentioned briefly earlier that the real rape script specifies the typical ingredients, the typical element of a situation that most people accept as rape. The attacker is a stranger, he uses physical force, victims show active resistance, and it's the stranger jumping out from behind a bush. And the problem with this, and if you give this description to people and ask them, is this rape? The great majority will say yes. But the real rape script is a myth. And And also, if you remove or change features, for example, the attacker is a former partner who uses verbal pressure or makes the victim drunk, and the victim is too shocked to resist, then very few people say this is a rape, even though it clearly is. And the problem with that is that the real rape script is a myth, and we know this from many, many victimization surveys. Most sexual assaults happen between people who know each other or even had or have a relationship. And quite often, sexual assaults do not involve active resistance because victims are frozen by fear. So the real rape script describes a situation that is by no means typical for a sexual assault that qualifies as rape. But nonetheless, the real rape script is a very powerful representation of the construct of sexual violence. As I said, it dominates public understanding of sexual violence. You will find widespread support for this description as a typical rape, and you will find that as soon as certain elements are changed, as soon as an incident is different from the real rape script, much less support for interpreting it as rape will be found. Another problematic aspect is that this real rape stereotype shifts blame to victims, especially when sexual violence happens between people who know each other, because the victim is not a real victim if the situation was not matched the real rape script. Importantly, the real rape script also affects victims' interpretation of what happened to them. They are far less likely to see themselves as victims of rape if they experience a situation that does not meet the standard of the real rape. And because of that, and again, this has been shown in many studies, victims of non-real rapes, as it were, victims whose attacker was a friend or a former or current partner and used alcohol to make them unable to reject their advances, for example, they are much less likely to report their offense to the police. And within the criminal justice system, the real rape script is also very powerful. And file analyses of police files about rape complaints show this very clearly, that at each step of the legal process, the non-stereotypical cases are much more likely to be dropped. And so eventually, only those rape complaints come to the courts that meet the real rape stereotype, because the other ones have been disregarded in previous steps by the police, by the prosecution. And this means that if rape cases come to courts, they are very likely to be close to the real rape script, which of course reinforces the idea that this is the real rape. So you can see that there is a whole sequence of problems resulting from this real rape script. And what we have done in quite a few studies is to show how the real rape script affects perceptions of victims and perpetrators. And in this final part of my talk, I would like to share just two findings from this research. The first is a study with graduate law students, not students from other areas or members of the public. And we gave these students a brief description, a written description of a rape case, and assigned them to three different groups. The first group received a rape description where the assailant was a stranger. The second group received a description where the attacker was an acquaintance, someone the person knew but wasn't an intimate partner. And the third group received a description of a rape incident in which the attacker was a former partner. And in each description, the woman very clearly said, "No, I don't want this," and tried to resist. There is nothing in the legal definition of rape that refers to this difference in victim-perpetrator relationship. So it shouldn't really make a difference in how much blame is apportioned to victims. And we asked them to rate the blame of the perpetrator, but also to rate how much the victim in these descriptions was to blame. And what you can see here is that the victim of the stranger rape is blamed least, followed by the acquaintance rape victim and the ex-partner victim, which is clearly supportive of the operation of the real rape stereotype. And these three mean scores of victim blame differ significantly between each other. And the next question then arises, is rape a special case, or isn't this the case with all other more similar criminal offenses too? So we ran another study in which we repeated the procedure of the first study using 3 different rape scenarios, each differing in terms of victim-perpetrator relationship, a stranger rape, an acquaintance rape, and an ex-partner rape. And we designed parallel scenarios describing a robbery. Something was stolen or robbed from the victim either by a stranger or an acquaintance or a former partner who took money away from the victim in these scenarios. And what you can see quite clearly is that for the rape cases, you see exactly the same pattern as before. Least victim blamed for stranger rape, then acquaintance rape, and then the ex-partner rape. The red bars are the robbery cases, and you can see here, nothing much happens. The means, the red bars, they do not differ significantly. So people do not take this information about victim-perpetrator relationship into account when they evaluate robbery scenarios, but they do so very clearly when they evaluate rape scenarios, which again is an indication of the real rape stereotype in operation. Now, what does that mean in terms of prevention? I think I could make the point that sexual scripts play a critical role in terms of reducing or increasing the odds of sexual violence. And so one implication for prevention is to change sexual scripts to make them less risky. For example, to create an awareness that drinking heavily in sexual interactions may be a risky strategy and that you can have good sexual relations without drinking alcohol. Also, it's important to raise awareness about the need to negotiate consent to move away from these stereotypical ambiguous communication patterns and to raise awareness about the role of pornography in informing sexual scripts. And we have just completed a project in which we developed an intervention that sought to achieve these goals. And this data are currently being analyzed, so I'm afraid I cannot tell you much about the results, except that they look promising and that we think that we have achieved some of our goals. Which brings me to the end of my talk, and thank you very much for your attention. Merci beaucoup de votre attention.